Good morning and welcome to everyone. On behalf of the Sovereign Order of Malta, I would like to thank all of you for coming to this first event, Refugee Protection and Human Trafficking, linked to the 2023 Global Refugee Forum. Allow me to express my special gratitude to the co-organizers, Caritas Internationalis, COATNET, Secours Catholique, Caritas France, UNHCR, the Special Rapporteur on Human Trafficking, as well as to all permanent missions co-sponsoring this event: Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, France, the Holy See, Switzerland, and UNODC. Today, I would like to welcome and thank our expert speakers: Madame Geneviève from Secours Catholique, Caritas France and COATNET, Ambassadeur Jérôme Bonafont, Permanent Representative of France, Ambassador Hugh Glauber, Permanent Representative of Switzerland, Mrs. Anna Ekstedt, Swedish Ambassador for Combating Trafficking in Persons, Mrs. Elizabeth Tan, Director, Division of International Protection, UNHCR, Mr. Vincent Cochetel, Special Envoy of the UNHCR for the Central Mediterranean Situation, Mr. Ibna Getashev, Head Protection Division, IOM, Mrs. Ronya O'Hara, Senior Human Rights Advisor, UNOHCR, Mrs. Tori Lawson, Director, Migration and Displacement Initiative, Save the Children, Mrs. Belancine Muzigali, Head of Anti-Trafficking and Migration Section, Caritas Rwanda, Mrs. Evota Loué, Head of Programs, Refugee Law Project, Uganda, Mrs. Francisca Fizzutelli, Deputy Director and Head of the Refugee and Migrants' Rights Team, Amnesty International. We are especially honored to have today Professor Slovan Moulani, Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. She shall moderate the second panel and conclude this event. Refugees are increasingly vulnerable to all forms of human trafficking: forced labor, sexual exploitation, forced marriages, forced motherhood, forced prostitution, removal of organs, sale and theft of children, use of children as child soldiers, or forcing them into criminality and terrorism. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and on the eve of the Global Refugee Forum on Refugees, we should make full use of all legal instruments to prevent and combat human trafficking, human rights, refugee law, labor law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and as you know, under specific circumstances, human trafficking could be prosecuted as a war crime or as a crime against humanity. International maritime law, and of course the Palermo Protocols and the Convention, without forgetting restorative justice. The Sovereign Order of Malta would like to underline the important role of religious leaders and religious congregations. Allow me to mention the most important. First, the Santa Marta Group. Second, the International Catholic Migration Commission, the Tanitacum Network, the Jesuit Refugee Services, COATNET, with the support of Caritas Internationalis. The Catholic Church's social doctrine makes it possible to identify and tackle the root causes of resurgence of slavery, the first of which is the loss of ethical reference protecting the fundamental rights of the human person as well as social and natural environment. Two key documents are the Laudato Si encyclical letter and the pastoral orientation on human trafficking. Share universal fundamental values and prayers based on an interreligious dialogue respecting the life and dignity of every person are an important contribution. One example is a joint declaration of religious leaders against modern slavery, signed on the 2nd of December 2014 in Vatican City by Catholic, Anglican, Orthodox, Protestant, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jewish religious leaders. The Order of Malta contributes to the fight against human trafficking by advocating through its bilateral diplomatic networks with 113 states and diplomatic networks through statements at each session of the Human Rights Council, at the UN General Assembly, and even at the Security Council. Last week, on the 7th of December, Ambassador Beresford Hill, the Order's ambassador in New York, made a statement before the Security Council on human trafficking as a threat to international peace and security. Also assisting victims through medical and social programs through its national associations and its worldwide humanitarian organization, Malteser International, often in cooperation with local Catholic bishops, among others in Boston, USA, Salzburg, Austria, and Tangier, Morocco, and congregations as the Sister of St. Louis, Lagos, in Nigeria, for the Bakita House. Also, we do offer a free online training course, and we did organize webinars on best practices to prevent and combat human trafficking since October 2020. 36 webinars have been organized. They are available for free. The Order of Malta's international status and diplomatic network, as well as its national associations and worldwide religious corps, Malteser International, will continue and increase to raise awareness of contemporary forms of slavery, increase assistance and protection to its victims, and contribute to their rehabilitation. Slide 3, please. Cooperation between all stakeholders is needed to effectively prevent, protect, and rehabilitate victims and survivors. Training is essential if governments, civil society, and all stakeholders are to become aware of and able to implement the legal, political, economic, and social instruments needed to combat the scourge of human trafficking and, for the second time in history, undertake to eradicate slavery. Next year, we shall work on implementing an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, that the Sovereign Order of Malta signed with the University of Peace, UPeace. With the cooperation of UNHCR and IOM, we shall organize training courses on human trafficking online and in person. To conclude, I would like to thank the permanent missions co-sponsoring this event, and also mention that in exactly 1 month, on the 11th of January, the Sovereign Order of Malta organizes an event at the UN headquarters in New York on healing victims of human trafficking. Voilà. Et maintenant, je voudrais donner la parole à Madame Geneviève du Secours Catholique, Caritas France et de COATNET, co-organisatrice de cet événement. Geneviève, à toi.
Merci beaucoup. Je remercie les co-organisateurs de cet événement dans le cadre du Forum mondial réfugié, tous les intervenants et en particulier Michel Veuthey pour sa détermination qui a permis de réunir des panels diversifiés ici, dans les locaux des Nations Unies à Genève, mais aussi à distance. Je remercie le HCR. Je remercie aussi Siobhan Oulali, rapporteuse spéciale de l'ONU sur la traite des personnes, spécialement des femmes et des enfants, qui est d'un grand appui pour comprendre le phénomène au niveau mondial et pour soutenir l'action dans nos pays respectifs en rappelant les engagements internationaux pris par les gouvernements. Le Secours catholique Caritas France, membre du réseau mondial Caritas, qui soutient le réseau COATNET contre la traite des êtres humains, a souhaité contribuer à ce forum alors qu'il est très investi sur le terrain au quotidien dans la prévention et la lutte contre la traite des personnes et en particulier des personnes réfugiées. Prévention des publics à risque, sensibilisation du grand public, accompagnement des personnes victimes dans tous les domaines, juridiques, administratifs, social, santé, logement, emploi et formation, plaidoyer pour faire évoluer et pour appliquer les lois en faveur des personnes victimes et pour combattre les criminels, développement du travail en réseau nationaux et internationaux. Déjà, il y a quelques années, des Caritas d'Europe et du Moyen-Orient, coordonnés par le Secours catholique Caritas France, ont mené ensemble une recherche-action sur la traite des êtres humains dans les situations de conflit et post-conflit, à une époque où le sujet était très peu abordé. Cela nous a permis d'être réactifs en février 2022, car nous avions déjà capitalisé des expériences et des bonnes pratiques suite au conflit au Tchétchénie, au Kosovo, au Liban et ailleurs. L'accueil des personnes fuyant la guerre en Ukraine et le travail de sensibilisation du grand public et de prévention des publics à risque pour éviter l'exploitation semble avoir porté ses fruits en limitant le nombre de victimes. Mais il faut que cette expérience positive menée aussi bien au niveau des organisations internationales que des associations de la société civile locale profite aujourd'hui à toutes les personnes fuyant leur pays ou région, de tous les continents, du fait de la guerre et pour toute autre cause, environnementale par exemple. L'UNHCR nous a beaucoup aidés en France à travailler ensemble, ministères et associations, pour faire des outils dans le cadre de la crise en Ukraine. Et pour nous, ça a été bien au-delà de ces outils parce que ça a vraiment permis un travail ensemble, France, internationale, associations et institutions. Et ça, je tiens vraiment à le saluer ici. Alors que l'on célèbre partout dans le monde le 75e anniversaire de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, nous souhaitons insister sur l'importance de resituer la prévention et la lutte contre toutes les formes de traite dans une démarche basée sur les droits, qu'il s'agisse de traite à des fins d'exploitation sexuelle, de travail forcé, d'esclavage domestique, de contraintes à commettre des délits, d'obligations à mendier, de trafic d'organes, d'enfants ou d'adultes, quel que soit le genre. Le réseau mondial COATNET présentera aussi ce jour ses engagements pour les années 2023-2027. Renforcer l'action mondiale contre la traite des êtres humains et protéger les droits des personnes en mouvement, c'est un programme que les associations et réseaux de COATNET s'engagent à faire ensemble, dans une approche globale abordant les différentes facettes du problème. Ensemble, pour amplifier l'impact de nos actions et pour contribuer efficacement à la lutte contre l'exploitation et la traite des êtres humains au niveau mondial. Cet événement ce matin à l'ONU permet de regarder au-delà de chacune de nos associations, de nos réseaux, de nos institutions nationales et internationales pour s'engager au mieux avec les personnes réfugiées dans la prévention comme dans la protection et le soutien des personnes victimes et survivantes. L'engagement multisecteur, protection des réfugiés et des migrants menacés ou affectés par la traite des personnes, s'alignant sur les objectifs de développement durable, soutient leur réalisation en mettant l'accent sur la protection des droits des victimes de la traite. Après cette introduction et le discours d'ouverture sur la prévention de la traite des êtres humains dans le contexte de protection des réfugiés, des déplacements internes et de la patrie, nous ferons un focus sur la protection, puis la prévention, avant d'échanger sur les engagements de chacun et chacune pour les années qui viennent et les bonnes pratiques. En cohérence avec le pacte mondial sur les réfugiés, mieux sensibiliser à la traite des personnes dans une approche fondée sur les droits de l'homme, en plaçant les victimes et les survivants au cœur du processus, renforcer la participation des personnes concernées, améliorer le recueil des données, former les bénévoles et les professionnels au contact avec de potentielles victimes, rendre plus efficaces nos coopérations entre pays et partenariats collaboratifs. Tout cela constitue des défis à relever ensemble au niveau mondial et déjà dans chacun de nos pays. C'est pourquoi j'ai le plaisir d'introduire notre ambassadeur de France, Jérôme Bonafont, représentant permanent de la France auprès des Nations Unies et des organisations internationales ici à Genève. Nous nous réjouissons ce jour du lancement au Musée des Migrations à Paris du 3e plan national en France de lutte contre l'exploitation et la traite des êtres humains, en espérant que les moyens pour le mettre en œuvre seront à la hauteur de l'enjeu. Monsieur l'ambassadeur, je vous remercie de votre présence et à vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Directrice. Chacun connaît votre engagement personnel, chacun connaît votre dynamisme, chacun connaît votre exigence à l'égard des pouvoirs publics et chacun respecte énormément ce que vous faites au nom du Secours catholique Caritas France pour ces causes qui nous sont tout à fait chères. Monsieur l'ambassadeur de l'Ordre souverain de Malte, vos propos avaient deux parties. Une partie qui retraçait l'ensemble de l'engagement international. J'y souscris à 100% et je n'y reviendrai pas dans ma propre intervention. Une autre partie qui exprimait les engagements particuliers des communautés auxquelles vous vous consacrez et que vous représentez, dont je salue la générosité. Et merci et bravo de préparer ce colloque. Merci également à Madame la directrice du HCR de venir aujourd'hui. Nous étions il y a quelques jours autour du haut-commissaire qui nous faisait part des gigantesques besoins du haut-commissariat pour les années qui viennent. Et il est clair que si l'on fait la liste des conflits ou des catastrophes naturelles qui, à travers le monde, peuvent engendrer des situations de déplacement forcé, cette liste est immense et elle appelle une mobilisation supplémentaire. Et merci également à Madame la représentante spéciale de bien vouloir être parmi nous. C'est un mandat particulièrement sensible et délicat que le vôtre, un mandat que nous saluons et que nous soutenons autant que nous le pouvons, avec cette projection particulière sur la situation des femmes et des enfants, car ce sont bien les vulnérables d'entre les vulnérables. Par millions, ce sont ces femmes et ces filles qui sont les premières victimes des trafics d'êtres humains. Je disais, pour prévenir ces trafics et protéger les femmes et les enfants, il faut la conjugaison des efforts internationaux et nationaux, publics et privés. Car il s'agit d'abord de lutter très concrètement contre des hommes et des groupes qui, par goût de la violence, par goût du pouvoir, par goût de l'argent, abusent de la faiblesse humaine. Il s'agit de renforcer les communautés d'accueil pour que l'accueil de réfugiés ne soit pas un fardeau impossible, mais soit une action de solidarité assumée et gratifiante. Et il s'agit de donner aux réfugiés les moyens de pouvoir s'intégrer dans leur communauté d'accueil temporaire et d'y mener une vie digne. Co-parraine du Forum mondial des réfugiés, la France a souhaité faire de l'inclusion et de la protection des femmes et des filles réfugiées le cœur de son engagement cette année. C'est l'initiative avec elle dont je souhaite vous dire ici quelques mots et qui formera l'essentiel de notre propos. Avec elle, nous coalisons les acteurs français, publics et privés, nationaux et régionaux, autour d'un programme d'action qui vise l'inclusion, la solidarité, la résilience des communautés hôtes et la protection des réfugiés. Ce programme à vocation nationale, nous l'ouvrons à l'initiative internationale et nous invitons nos partenaires étrangers, qu'ils soient publics ou privés, à s'y associer. Ce programme, il a deux volets. D'abord, un volet qui concerne notre action intérieure. Il s'agit de prévenir et protéger les femmes et filles réfugiées par l'intégration. Et à cet égard, nous avons 4 volets. Un premier volet, c'est de fournir aux réfugiés un accompagnement global et individualisé vers les études, vers l'emploi, vers des actions de formation et de mettre en place des programmes de sensibilisation dans les entreprises et de renforcer l'engagement du secteur privé. De quoi s'agit-il? Il s'agit que les réfugiés ne soient pas des personnes isolées et désarmées dans la société qui les accueille, mais des personnes qui y trouvent leur place le temps qu'elles doivent y rester. Deuxièmement, renforcer la prise en compte des enfants dans les politiques nationales d'accueil en leur facilitant l'accès aux procédures d'octroi d'une protection internationale au titre de l'asile et de la patrie et à la protection sociale. Chacun sait que les enfants sont les plus vulnérables, il n'est pas besoin d'y assister. Troisièmement, faciliter l'accès à l'emploi par une meilleure reconnaissance des diplômes et des qualifications professionnelles acquises par les réfugiés avant l'arrivée en France. Car il est courant que les réfugiés qui ne connaissent pas le pays dans lequel ils arrivent soient dotés de qualifications dont on a besoin et qu'il est bon de pouvoir valoriser au plus vite. Et quatrièmement, dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre du plan interministériel pour l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes 2023-2027, toutes et tous égaux, la France lancera un appel à manifestation d'intérêt conjoint du ministère de l'Intérieur et du ministère chargé de l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes pour le développement d'ateliers de sensibilisation sur l'égalité entre femmes et hommes en direction des primo-arrivants, dont les personnes réfugiées. Il est connu en effet que bon nombre de personnes viennent de sociétés où l'égalité femmes-hommes n'est pas pleinement réalisée, voire où les femmes ont un statut qui ne les conduit pas naturellement à l'emploi. Il s'agit de leur dire que lorsqu'elles arrivent en France, elles ont les mêmes droits que les hommes, les mêmes opportunités que les hommes, et qu'elles doivent se voir donner les armes pour y accéder. Concernant notre action extérieure, il s'agit d'exprimer l'impératif de solidarité. Nous savons que l'écrasante majorité des réfugiés sont accueillis dans des pays proches de leur lieu de déplacement par des pays qui souvent n'ont pas de gros moyens pour les accueillir. On pense au Tchad, on pense à la Turquie, on pense à l'Iran, on pense à tant de pays qui accueillent des centaines de milliers, voire des millions de réfugiés. Alors nous avons décidé, là aussi, 5 points. D'abord, l'Agence française de développement, qui est notre opérateur du développement, va allouer une part de ses financements à des projets d'appui avec une attention particulière aux enjeux de genre et de résilience au changement climatique, appui aux réfugiés dans les pays d'accueil, en coopération avec le HCR et avec les communautés hôtes. Le directeur général de l'AFD fera les annonces précises au moment du forum. Deuxièmement, nous voudrions faire monter en puissance des financements de projets de formation professionnelle de femmes réfugiées sur des métiers d'avenir dans un certain nombre de pays. Pour vous citer un exemple, un projet de 5 millions d'euros alloué par l'AFD en 2021 à la Jordanie pour accompagner la création d'opportunités économiques en faveur des réfugiés syriens et des communautés hôtes vulnérables. Troisièmement, développer et financer des projets au sein des États coparrains du Forum accueillant un grand nombre de réfugiés. J'en cite quelques-uns, la Colombie, la Jordanie et l'Ouganda, afin de soulager la pression qui pèse sur leur communauté, avec un accent sur l'impact climatique et de genre. Quatrièmement, financer des programmes d'éducation et de protection en faveur des filles réfugiées, y compris dans les communautés d'accueil. La France contribuera au développement de centres d'éducation et de protection de filles réfugiées dans les pays d'accueil, tels que le soutien au programme Veuthey de l'UNICEF en Libye. Enfin, nous souhaitons favoriser l'intégration des femmes et des filles réfugiées au sein de leur communauté d'accueil à travers le sport. Nous avons des projets en Égypte, en Jordanie, au Liban, dans les territoires palestiniens occupés, pour renforcer cette dimension de l'intégration. Nous invitons, je le disais, les autres États participant au Forum mondial des réfugiés, mais aussi la société civile internationale, à s'associer à ce avec elle qui figurera sur le site du HCR et auquel chacun pourra souscrire par des engagements. Mercredi, la Première ministre du gouvernement français, Mme Emmanuelle Borne, présentera de façon générale notre engagement pour les réfugiés à l'ouverture du forum en tant qu'État coparrain, et nous présenterons alors l'ensemble de nos engagements. Vous l'avez compris, la question des femmes et des filles réfugiées figure comme un élément central de cet engagement nouveau, et je remercie beaucoup les organisateurs de ce colloque, d'abord de l'avoir organisé, et deuxièmement de nous avoir donné la parole.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur l'ambassadeur, pour la participation de la France à cet événement, pour vos aimables paroles et votre importante déclaration annonçant un 3e plan national d'action contre la traite 2024-2027, mettant l'accent sur l'importance de l'inclusion et de l'intégration des réfugiés. Et voilà, et maintenant je voudrais donner la parole à l'ambassadeur Jürgen Lauber, représentant permanent de la Suisse, qui nous honore aussi de sa participation. Excellence, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, cher Michel, mesdames, messieurs, chers collègues. Je tiens à vous remercier pour l'organisation de cet événement. La Suisse se félicite en particulier de sa collaboration avec la rapporteure spéciale sur la traite des humains, en particulier les femmes et les enfants. Merci beaucoup d'être là aussi avec nous sur le podium. Comme vous le savez, c'était déjà évoqué, nous sommes confrontés à un triste record. Plus que 110 millions de personnes sont actuellement déplacées dans le monde, dont 40% des enfants. Le risque lié à la traite des êtres humains est fortement augmenté dans les contextes de déplacement forcé. Le manque d'accès à des voies de migration sûres et régulières incite de nombreuses personnes en fuite à recourir au service des passeurs pour franchir des frontières. Bien souvent, les camps de réfugiés sont des zones à risque, surtout pour les femmes. Les enfants sont aussi particulièrement exposés au risque d'enlèvement, à l'exploitation à des fins de mariage, de travail, de recrutement par des groupes armés ou criminels. La lutte contre le crime de la traite exige une approche holistique, impliquant une coordination étroite entre agences étatiques, organisations internationales, la société civile et le secteur privé. Lors du Forum mondial sur les réfugiés, la Suisse annoncera un engagement spécifique dans le cadre de son approche impliquant la société tout entière. Sur le plan national, elle continuera à s'engager dans la détection et l'assistance de toutes les victimes potentielles de la traite au cours de la procédure d'asile. Les villes suisses poursuivront leurs efforts pour une meilleure identification et évaluation des risques de traite parmi les réfugiés arrivant d'Ukraine. La police fédérale se dotera d'outils permettant d'identifier les victimes de la traite, notamment sur l'Internet. Sur le plan international, la Suisse continuera à se concentrer sur la prévention du déplacement forcé et de la traite des êtres humains. Nous continuerons également à soutenir les victimes de la traite dans les pays d'origine, de transit et de destination. Par exemple, à travers la sensibilisation des intervenants de première ligne et le renforcement des structures de soutien juridique et psychosocial. À travers ces différentes actions, la Suisse se réjouit de pouvoir contribuer dans le cadre du Forum à l'engagement multi-acteurs visant à combattre la traite. En accueillant le Forum mondial sur les réfugiés, j'ai l'espoir que Genève soit le théâtre d'une solidarité internationale renouvelée envers les populations déplacées, et cela sera un moment clé pour renforcer la protection des plus vulnérables. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Merci mille fois, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, pour vos aimables paroles et pour la contribution de la Suisse à la lutte contre la traite des êtres humains sur le plan national et international. We now have also an important speaker, Mrs. Elizabeth Tan, Director of International Protection at the UNHCR. Mrs. Tan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to join everyone on the podium in welcoming all participants joining this in person as well as online linked event for the Global Refugee Forum of 2023. The Global Refugee Forum is our opportunity to seek to strengthen our collective action, unity as well as impact. Is where world leaders, organizations, and individuals are coming together to commit to take concrete steps to support refugees and other displaced people. We appreciate sincerely the states that have joined us in supporting this initiative and today's event. Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, France, the Holy See, and Switzerland. We also extend special thanks to the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. Thank her for her work and for leading the multi-stakeholder pledge on protection of refugees and migrants at risk or affected by trafficking in persons. With the support of ILO, IOM, UNODC, ICAT, and of course ourselves, UNHCR. We appreciate also the excellent collaboration with all the partners in the organization of this event today, with the Sovereign Order of Malta, alongside Caritas Internationale, COATNET, Secours Catholique France, and UNODC. As we've heard already, unprecedented levels of displacement, increasing numbers of the world's forcibly displaced and stateless persons face poverty, discrimination, and marginalization, which in turn exposes them to the risk of trafficking. Our efforts to reinforce protection and solutions in accordance with the Global Compact on Refugees need to include them. Trafficking happens when people decide to embark on dangerous journeys when they wait for years for the outcomes of an asylum claim, when access to decent work and education opportunities are not there, when no durable solutions are in sight. It is in situations of despair that traffickers may appear to offer support, only to trap people into sexual exploitation, forced marriages, domestic servitude, forced labor, or recruitment into armed groups. The goals of preventing and addressing trafficking can be advanced by protection and expanding opportunities and solutions for forcibly displaced people, including along those dangerous routes. The High Commissioner for Refugees has called for a panoramic approach in responding to mixed movements that comprehensively address the challenges faced by refugees and migrants along those routes. This can mitigate protection risks and reduce human suffering, as well as offering alternatives, effective, right-based alternatives to dangerous journeys. The Global Refugee Forum brings momentum that can catalyze support from multiple stakeholders across the whole of society to advance the Global Compact on Refugees goals. In this regard, we thank all states and NGOs, UN agencies and others that have already submitted pledges on the prevention of trafficking and response to trafficking. Specifically, we call on others to join and commit to operationalize this multi-stakeholder pledge, including implementing concrete initiatives and programs that will benefit refugees, stateless persons, and migrants at risk of or affected by trafficking. Thank you to all those present for your solidarity, and we look forward to hearing from our expert speakers and panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Tan, and especially for mentioning the need to reinforce cooperation between all stakeholders, including the Malta, Caritas, Internationalists, and COATNET. So, thank you. We are looking forward for an increased cooperation. And now we have the keynote speaker, the Special Rapporteur, Professor Johan Munadi, who shall give us a keynote speech on prevention of trafficking in the context of refugee protection, internal displacement, and statelessness. Professor Munadi, with our gratitude for all your efforts and for your contribution to this event, we are looking forward to your statement.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, Excellencies, distinguished guests, panelists, all participants here today and online. I'm very grateful to all of the co-sponsors and co-hosts of today's event, and thank you for prioritizing this issue of prevention of trafficking and protection of victims of trafficking and those at risk of trafficking as we begin this week in which we will host here in Geneva the Global Refugee Forum. This has been a priority area of work for my mandate as Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons over the last 3 years, and we have benefited greatly from the cooperation and support of UNHCR, from civil society and from various organisations and states. Building on the commitment in the New York Declaration, the Global Compact for Refugees and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, we have launched a multi-stakeholder pledge calling on states and partners to commit to concrete actions to prevent trafficking among asylum seekers, refugees, displaced persons and stateless persons, and to ensure effective access to asylum and other forms of international protection for trafficked persons and those at risk. Trafficking in persons is a serious human rights violation. It is a violation of international humanitarian law, international criminal law also, and one that treats human beings as commodities, that enslaves, degrades and brutalizes its victims. Too often, within the international community, within the UN system, we have treated and responded to trafficking in persons as primarily an issue of criminal justice, we have not mobilised and brought to bear the full resources of our normative system of international human rights law or international refugee law. This is an opportunity to do that and to correct those gaps. Prevention of trafficking requires us to commit to the effective implementation of international human rights law and international refugee law and international humanitarian law, in line with the Global Compact for Refugees, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and the commitment to effective realisation of rights as set out in our fragile and now very threatened foundational system for the protection of human rights. Today at the UN in Geneva, we celebrate and renew our commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a common standard of achievement globally, a document that combines generations of rights, socio-economic and civil and political. It enshrines and commits to the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution and commits to the non-derogable peremptory norm prohibiting slavery, servitude and forced labour, which includes the prohibition of trafficking in persons for all purposes of exploitation. We know that forced displacement increases risks of trafficking, particularly when people are pushed into dangerous, risky journeys and denied effective access to safe migration pathways and pathways to international protection. For asylum seekers and refugees, protracted situations of displacement with limited access to education, decent work, often unsafe accommodation, precarious status, this increases the risk of being targeted by those who would exploit such vulnerabilities. And it is critical now that states and the international community act to prevent such human rights violations and to ensure effective access to protection. To realise those rights, the multi-stakeholder pledge highlights opportunities to commit to expanding resettlement, rights-based family reunification, to expanding safe migration pathways to prevent trafficking among asylum seekers, refugees and displaced persons. It commits to ensuring effective access to asylum and other forms of international protection without discrimination, recognising that providing such protection, such effective access to asylum, reduces risks of trafficking and re-trafficking. We urgently need to strengthen our protection responses and systems for those who are displaced, to integrate responses to risks of trafficking into our child protection work, or work on sexual and gender-based violence in humanitarian and protection settings, and recognise other risks of exploitation such as forced labour, exploitation in criminal activities, child and forced marriage. We must move away from the acceptance, tacit or otherwise, of survival strategies or negative coping mechanisms that are premised and rooted in serious human rights violations, including of trafficking in persons. We need to strengthen our systems for identifying victims of trafficking among refugees and asylum seekers and displaced persons, and identifying those at risk, recognising the risks also that refugees and asylum seekers may become victims of labour exploitation, exploited in irregular work, often in informal economies. We need to work to ensure access to decent work through partnerships with private sectors, through ensuring the right to work, to decent work, limiting opportunities then for profiteering through exploitation. We know that children, particularly unaccompanied and separated asylum-seeking and refugee children, are particularly at risk. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is almost universally ratified. It includes protections, core protections for refugee and asylum-seeking children and children at risk of trafficking. It is essential that we commit to strengthening child protection systems, to ensuring a protective, safe environment for children, safe accommodation, timely appointment of guardians, and recognise the rights of all children to protection without discrimination as children. We must also recognise and address racial discrimination and racial inequalities and injustice that limit access to protection for children, that denies their childhood unique vulnerability and their right to protection. We need to build integrated services. Integrated services are critical to building support for host communities and with host communities, to continue to build partnerships, to strengthen referral pathways, drawing on services developed in response to sexual and gender-based violence or to child protection needs. We need to engage much more effectively with development partners, including international financial institutions, And that is something that my mandate is trying to prioritise, particularly in country visit settings, and with all UN agencies and international organisations and civil society, to prevent trafficking among refugees and asylum seekers. The multi-stakeholder pledge highlights the need to address the gender dimensions of persecution, the rights of women and girls to effective action to prevent trafficking, and to protection against refoulement, including through recognition of risks of re-trafficking. It highlights the risks of sexual exploitation, child and forced marriage, and the urgency of ensuring that screening and protection mechanisms are strengthened. We also need to ensure disability inclusion and the rights of persons with disabilities in our refugee and asylum procedures, and recognise that persons with disabilities may be at heightened risk of trafficking due to discrimination, inaccessible services. We need to ensure that accommodation and refugee status determination procedures are accessible, in line with the commitments in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the social model of disability, recognising all types of disability, and a human rights-based response. I am pleased that my mandate has highlighted the nexus between trafficking and disability, and called for disability rights responses in trafficking measures, in anti-trafficking measures, including in responses to risks that may be faced by asylum seekers and refugees. And that is included also in our pledge. We need to recognise the risks that arise from statelessness, particularly for children, and support action to ensure universal birth registration and an end to statelessness. I want to highlight also the links to other pledges that are being presented at the Global Refugee Forum, the need for enhanced protection at sea, and alternatives to detention, which are also relevant to victims of trafficking and prevention of trafficking. To conclude, I highlight again the importance of partnerships that are core to the work of prevention of trafficking and protection of victims and survivors. Support for host communities, partnership with host communities, is essential to prevent trafficking among refugees and asylum seekers. And that includes partnerships with trade unions, civil society, human rights defenders, the private sector, faith-based organisations. And as we mark the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we are reminded again that the right to have rights should not be dependent on one's status, that refugees and asylum seekers are seeking protection from persecution and must be ensured protection, including from the dehumanising risks of trafficking in persons. Thank you.
I'd like to warmly thank the Special Rapporteur for her important statement, underlining the need for partnerships and the need to mobilize all legal mechanisms available for preventing and combating human trafficking, especially protecting children. And thank you. And now, opening the first panel, on the program we had Ambassador Anna Ekstedt. I think she's on. Oh, here you are. Yeah. Okay. Tack så mycket. So, thank you very much for being with us. And you are ambassador for combating trafficking persons in Sweden. And clearly, very grateful to have you, because as everyone doesn't know, Sweden is a pioneer in combating human trafficking, and especially for women forced into prostitution. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear colleagues and friends. I want to start by, of course, thanking the UN Special Rapporteur Against Trafficking and the UNHCR and all the co-conveners for this important event, as well as for initiating the multi-stakeholder pledge on refugee protection and trafficking that is connected to this year's Global Refugee Forum. Trafficking human beings is indeed a crime that seriously violates the human rights of the victims, and we all need to make sure that we keep this human rights issue high up on the agenda. We also need to make sure efficient identification and protection measures, and this is a joint obligation for all of us. The work against trafficking in all its forms is indeed a high priority for the Swedish government. Trafficking in human beings is a serious crime that is often linked to and also render millions of dollars in illegal profit to organized crime on a yearly basis. Only in the EU, the estimate from the EU Commission is that sexual exploitation or trafficking for sexual exploitation renders 14.9 billion euros on an annual basis in the EU, which is of course a staggering number, telling us of the high exploitation going on in the EU and also globally then. It is so unfortunately clear from recent reports that we're not doing enough to prevent trafficking and protect victims of this crime. Data from both the UN as well as the EU show that far too many people in the world are being trafficked, and many of them are refugees or vulnerable migrants. It's clear that this is a crime that is difficult to tackle and more efficient prevention efforts are needed. Trafficking unfortunately comes, as you all know, in many forms, such as sexual exploitation, forced begging, domestic servitude, forced marriages, trafficking for labor exploitation. The list is long. Trafficking for sexual exploitation is indeed one of the worst forms of gender-based violence, and in Sweden it is addressed and included in the national work to combat men's violence against women and to enhance gender equality in society. A high number of people are being trafficked for sexual exploitation, and the majority of them are women, and far too many of them are children. We see an increase of sexual exploitation of girls, which is of course extremely worrying. It's also extremely worrying that the UN Global Report showed that almost 1/3 of the victims identified in the world are children. And as you know, when new crises appear worldwide, traffickers often abuse the situation to profit from the vulnerability of people in need. The illegal Russian aggression against Ukraine has once again reminded us of this, as we see an increase of vulnerabilities to exploitation and trafficking, for sexual exploitation, but also for other forms. We should never accept that women, girls, and boys are fleeing war and conflict end up in exploitation and abuse. And Sweden has, since the invasion, highlighted the importance of a trafficking perspective in the humanitarian work in Ukraine and also in the neighboring countries and all the countries where Ukrainian refugees end up. The current situation has indeed reminded us of our joint obligation under the UN Palermo Protocol Article 9.5 to address the demand that fosters trafficking in different forms of exploitation. To highlight the importance to address the demand, Sweden held a presidency conference in Stockholm in March this year, Prevention Models Against the Demand that Fosters Trafficking for Sexual Exploitation, a conference that gathered experts from international organizations, member states, and also civil society to exchange expertise and discuss the pressing needs in this field. And I think we should learn from the prevention measures that have been done jointly in the Ukrainian humanitarian crisis to also be applied in other crises. Sweden is also currently assessing our own work in providing assistance to victims. There is currently an ongoing inquiry on exit programs for people in prostitution and people exiting trafficking for sexual exploitation. We also have now legal amendments in Sweden when it comes to the trafficking legislation. For example, last year there was an amendment on reflection periods for victims of trafficking, separating the application for reflection periods from the legal investigation, making sure that also not only the prosecutors or the police can apply for a reflection period for victims of trafficking, but also social services that identify people that they fear might be a victim of trafficking. Also, just to say that the migration agencies need to be fully equipped to identify victims of trafficking among asylum seekers and also refugees and also other migrant groups. And in Sweden, the migration agency is one of the agencies, state agencies, that do identify the highest numbers of victims and reported to the police and the social services. So they do play a very important role in the national referral mechanism. And of course, NGOs also play a crucial role in national referrals in order to ensure identification, but also to provide support to victims. Sweden is also a supporter of the UN Voluntary Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking, a trust fund run by the UNODC that we see as a very important fund to ensure global spread of support to NGOs working on identification and protection of victims globally. It is, of course, of utmost importance that all citizens have the necessary tools to counter and prevent trafficking. And a group that is maybe not often thought about are diplomats and consular staff. So together with the Council of the Baltic Sea States and the IOM, Sweden has supported a handbook for embassies and diplomatic missions on how to assist and protect victims of trafficking. The Foreign Service and also diplomatic missions in general cannot actually play a crucial role when it comes to this, both when it comes to visa application scenarios, in consular cases, or in contact with local authorities and civil society actors. This group can indeed play a crucial role in preventing trafficking and also then contributing to prevention initiatives and prosecution of these cases. There are, as you are aware, a number of factors that contribute to trafficking in human beings, such as poverty, war, crisis, displacement, corruption, discrimination, and lack of opportunities. These are issues that all need to be addressed in protection and prevention efforts. However, in order to be successful, we need to address the core root cause, namely the demand. This is indeed an obligation for all EU member states under Article 9.5. This needs to be done by legislation or other forms of educational measures and law-changing measures. Sweden appreciates the close cooperation that we have in France in order to tackle trafficking and sexual exploitation. But we also need to listen, of course, to the voices of victims and survivors and include them in the efforts ahead in order to have efficient prevention and protection mechanisms in place. And then we also need to listen to migrants and refugees and hear their stories to learn from them. UNHCR is, of course, with its unique mandate, has an important role in the work to prevent and protect victims of trafficking. Initiatives that serve to ensure early identification, recognition, and protection of refugees and to combat human trafficking are indeed key. And here we need to have much more efficient collective measures in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your intervention and for Sweden's contribution to the prevention of human trafficking, including the Swedish or Nordic model on prostitution, and on behalf of Ukrainian refugees. The UN Trust Fund is indeed worth supporting, and the voices of victims need to be listened to. Et maintenant, j'ai le grand plaisir de donner la parole à un expert du terrain, Monsieur Vincent Cochetel, UN Special Envoy for the Central Mediterranean Situation. Vincent, you have the floor.
Merci, Michel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to share with you today 3 observations. I'll be very practical. The first thing I'd like to share with you is what I heard from the first victim of trafficking on this daily route leading to the Central Mediterranean Sea that I met. It was silence. And that silence meant more than any spoken word. That silence communicated the challenges of establishing a meaningful, respectful, and effective communication with a victim of trafficking. The young man from Mali had been literally enslaved for almost 2 years by his traffickers. He was shackled most of the time and subject to various forms of torture and deprivation. His silence communicated his fear, but it also reminded me that trust cannot be assumed. It takes time, needs to be built, and it works differently with different people, based on their culture, age, gender, experience, trauma. It took him maybe 15 minutes to move his eyes from his shoes to meet mine. His look expressed fear as he was still at arm's length of his torturer. The first meeting was almost entirely non-verbal. And while I let the shared silence between us and a cup of tea create a zone of comfort, my mind focused on the referrals to be made. Yet between what was on the glossy paper of the National Referral Mechanism for Victims of Trafficking and what services actually were available, there was a huge gap. Victim response without protection means nothing. on whether the person was a refugee or a migrant did not really have any relevance at this point. The person needed physical, legal, social protection. Well, the first thing I looked for was shelter in the National Referral Mechanism Handbook. The first one did not exist in reality. The next one was full. The third one was too far on men traveling with risk of being undocumented. Then I looked for counseling. The specialized counseling for this person was not immediately available. On the local NGO running it, and no interpreters for the language the person spoke. Third, medical care. Access to medical care was impossible due to the lack of documentation and gap in the national legislation. And I could go on. And that's the experience I had in many of those African countries on these routes leading to the central Mediterranean Sea. The second observation I'd like to share is my frustration at the growing gap between the renewed political calls suggesting that more is being done against human traffickers and the reality I know at least on the route where I work. Might be different in the context of the Ukraine situation. The UNODC annual report brings its load of depressing statistics. One of them always strikes me is about the decreasing prosecution and conviction rates for human traffickers. How often have we heard we need to defeat the business model of the human traffickers? But are we making progress? Do we consider this crime as seriously as we consider drug trafficking or arms trafficking? Do we follow money flows? Do we effectively use existing sanction regime? Do we capacitate adequately judicial authorities in this area? Do we recognize victims of trafficking as right holders and as potential key assets for effective prosecution? I leave you the answer. My concern also relates to the growing gap between capacity building efforts and victims' assistance in this field. A recent report from the UN system in March 2023 documented that most of the funding relating to human trafficking go towards data collection, research, soft capacity building activities. I'm not saying it's not needed, but efforts need to be better balanced with predictable victims' assistance. UNHCR will publish in January 2024 a report showing that in 16 African countries along the route I cover, services for victims of trafficking are not available where they are most needed, such as in border areas or in critical mixed movement hubs where the risks are the most acute. Worse, this report updates a study we published 2 years ago, and it revealed that some of the services for victims have now disappeared due to the lack of support. This is particularly the case for access to psychosocial counseling and access to justice. And because of the lack of alternative solutions and support, a foreign victim of trafficking who is not a refugee is often just quickly sent back home, irrespective of the risk of re-trafficking and without any form of access to justice. Finally, the third observation I'd like to make is my firm belief that more can be done on the prevention, protection, prosecution and partnership. As an example, together with IOM and UNODC, we set up 3 years ago a small pilot project without any dedicated resource, known as Caritas, to pick up from social media posts, including those originating from traffickers themselves who publicize their ransom request, incidents of human trafficking involving migrants and refugees in Libya, Chad, Niger, and Sudan. We were able to document cases involving more than 15,000 victims. Referrals led in some instances to their release from traffickers' underground networks, but not everyone was released. But no one can say today we didn't know. These cases are known. Impunity for the traffickers is no longer a certainty. This small project illustrates that we can do more with little. and we should not give up, feel powerless, confronted to these many challenges. We can all contribute to a better response. What we need is less words and more focused action. Thank you.
Merci Vincent. Thank you, Michel, for especially highlighting the need, first, to establish trust with victims and survivors, and second, to give them access to resources, but also to justice, and your call for governments to give enough resources, indeed, to capacity building, but also to care and reintegrate victims. So, thank you very much. And now we have Itna Gedachev. So thank you very much for being with us. Excuse me. Thank you very much for being with us. You're the head of the protection division at IOM, and I think your contribution is also very important. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying how fully we agree with what my good friend and colleague Vincent has said on behalf of UNHCR and the Special Rapporteur. Victim-centered approach has always been what IOM has advocated. Thank you once again for extending the invitation to the International Organization for Migration to be part of this critical discussion today on protection for refugees and migrants at risk or affected by trafficking in persons. As you know, counter-trafficking is one of the earliest specialized protection areas of work. Dating back to the early 1990s, these actions laid the foundation for most of the protection work that we do today. For over 25 years, IOM, in cooperation with partners, has assisted more than 100,000 trafficked individuals worldwide. IOM is committed to keeping counter-trafficking at the center of its protection work as it works to improve and expand its protection program. Indeed, the global context demands such commitment. The number of people who are trafficked or at risk of trafficking continues to rise globally. Multiple crises, from armed conflicts to economic hardships and climate change, are exacerbating trafficking risks and spurring the emergence of new forms of exploitation. The global estimates of modern slavery publication, which may be known to many of you, is jointly produced by IOM, ILO, and the Walk Free Foundation. The latest was in 2022. Indicated that approximately 50 million people are in situations of modern slavery. And this is a huge jump from the estimate only 5 years earlier, in 2017, when the figure stood at 40 million people. It's based on this long experience and extensive analysis of the global landscape of trafficking in persons that IOM established its priorities to combat trafficking through a victim-centered, comprehensive approach. We know that it's the only way forward, considering human trafficking is both a crime and a gross violation of human rights. A stark reminder on the impact it has on human rights was recently presented 2023 report to the Human Rights Council by the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Person, who is with us today. It is with the victims' realities in mind that we must intensify our efforts to protect the rights and dignity of the most vulnerable. The multi-stakeholder pledge on protection for refugees and migrants at risk of trafficking in persons is an excellent example of actionable commitments that we jointly made towards this goal. Under Ms. Mulali's leadership, it places us all in a unified front with shared determination. It gives us a roadmap for action to meet the objectives of both the Global Compact on Refugees, which gathers us here today, and the Global Compact for Migration. For IOM, advancing on this commitment is extremely important. We are strongly committed to collective and collaborative approaches to end human trafficking. The organization has established a global partnership network that incorporates a wide range of actors. At the global level, IOM colleagues with UNHCR, the anti-trafficking task team under the Global Protection Cluster. In 2023, IOM chairs the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Person, commonly known as COATNET, along with the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children. IOM is part of the UN Task Force on Combating Human Trafficking and Forced Labor in Supply Chains, Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons Expert Coordination Team, and the UN Migration Network work streams on trafficking in persons and smuggling migrants. We also lead the Migration Action Group of the Alliance 8.7 Policy Group. After a critical assessment of over 25 years of counter-trafficking interventions, this year, IOM released its counter-trafficking theory of change. It defines 8 core intervention models for counter-trafficking, which have shown results and which IOM is well placed to implement, that will be used to support the design and implementation of effective counter-trafficking programming. Through it, IOM aims to attain tangible change in reducing prevalence and harm from human trafficking. We wish to establish a cutting-edge evidence base on what works in counter-trafficking, and we also would like to develop proven intervention models ready for replication. The critical assessment and continuous monitoring confirms what Ms. Mulale presented earlier this year. Displacement, internally and across borders, heightened risks of trafficking in persons. IOM's Missing Migrant Project, which has been collecting data for close to 10 years, has recorded nearly 60,000 deaths. Despite commitments to saving lives, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees, we see little substantive action, and 2023 is on track to have a record-breaking number of deaths across routes to Europe, in the Americas, and beyond. Migrants traveling irregularly are susceptible to exploitation and abuse. If you allow me to quote some of the data, and this has been said earlier, every second person, 55% of trafficked individuals are trafficked for purposes of sexual exploitation. And every third person is 37% of trafficked individuals for purposes of forced labor. And tragically, over a quarter of all identified victims are trafficked as children. In response to these complex and interconnected factors, IOM is championing 3 key objectives that will guide our operations for the coming 5 years. This comes with our new leadership, and we hope assuming the Director Generalship of the organization. Firstly, our foremost priority is preservation of human life, saving lives and protecting people. Secondly, we are dedicated to driving solutions to displacement. As we discussed, displacement heightens risks of trafficking, exasperates existing risks, and creates new risks. Therefore, our Director General has set an agenda for driving solutions to displacement, including those that are caused by climate change. And the third is expanding pathways for regular migration. People are taking incalculable risks because such regular pathways are absent, and they are taking very risky routes, exposing themselves to the dangers of trafficking. We remain committed to achieve these objectives, working hand in hand with all partners in policy, operational, and advocacy spheres. I would like to conclude by reiterating IOM's commitment to work with you all and to ensure that we live in a world that is free from violence, exploitation, and abuse. I thank you very much for the opportunity, and we look forward to the discussion among colleagues today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Geneviève, for also mentioning the victim-centered approach, reminding us that both global compacts could be useful, and for the existence of ICAT, this interagency network. Now we have Tori Clausen, Director, Migration and Displacement Initiative of Save the Children. Please, you have the floor. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Excellencies and colleagues, I am grateful for the opportunity to be here today at this important event. It's an opportunity to share remarks on a research study that Save the Children did together last year, together with Samuel Hall, and with the support of the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation, called Tipping Points and Turning Points. And the aim of this qualitative research was to understand how programs and policies can respond to the risks of child trafficking and other abuses on the central Mediterranean route. We conducted multiple focus group discussions with child migrants, as well as key informant interviews with community leaders, experts such as Vincent Cochetel, and even smugglers. So I wanted to highlight some of the key findings from the Tipping Points and Turning Points report. First, and very importantly, we found that a protected ecosystem plays a critical role in preventing trafficking and aggravated smuggling. The panel after this one is focusing on prevention, so it is perhaps a nice segue to highlight the critical role protection plays in the prevention of trafficking and exploitation of children. Our research showed that this protected ecosystem diminishes during migration, and so the risks of trafficking and exploitation increase as children get further away from their point of origin, their homes. Migrant children are likely to use several smugglers in a chain of trust to reach their destination. The first smuggler might typically be someone that they know or a friend of a friend, but the farther away they get from home, the greater the risk of ending up with someone beyond that chain of trust and being exploited and trafficked. Importantly, risks, as has already been stated, are particularly acute during border crossings and in border areas. These are places where there is often a transfer of the child from one smuggler to another, or where traffickers prey on children. Second, we found smuggling can be a normalized and widely accepted practice in some communities. Smugglers are often seen as facilitators to help children pursue a better life. Unfortunately, children themselves are often willing to put up with exploitative treatment, since we found they have a very narrow perception of what is trafficking. Generally, they only understand themselves as victims of a crime when there is a clear sale or exchange of money. And this can make aggravated smuggling an acceptable risk. Third, the research found that although there are typically legal and policy frameworks in place to protect migrants and victims of trafficking, border control and management are often a higher priority. In practice, this means these protective laws and policies often remain unenforced, and there are few, if any, services for children in border regions where they are most vulnerable, including for victims of trafficking. So what can be done? Well, first and foremost, since protection plays an essential role in preventing, as well as identifying and reporting incidents of child trafficking, investing in and improving the protected ecosystem is a critical step to take to prevent trafficking of children. There are a number of approaches that can be taken to do this, such as strengthening transnational partnerships in case management so authorities from bordering countries can work together to protect children. Other steps to be taken include strengthening the capacity of community leaders and other actors, training migration management and frontline border control staff in child protection, and increasing access and quality child protection service provision for children, especially at borders and in border regions. As part of Save the Children's commitment at this Global Refugee Forum, we've pledged to strengthen child protection, and I very much encourage member states and others to do the same, in line with the multi-stakeholder pledge on anti-trafficking, as well as the multi-stakeholder pledge for children's rights. Second, member states should establish and expand safe, regular migration routes to reduce the reliance of children on smuggling, and specifically focus on identification and referral of victims of trafficking. It's important as well that governments don't criminalize trafficking victims. Not only does criminalization violate children's rights to protection, fear of criminalization can make children rely more on irregular routes and therefore expose themselves to more risk. Third and finally, I encourage member states to pledge to implement and strengthen as needed child-sensitive anti-trafficking laws and policies, ensuring migrant children are treated as children first and foremost, with equal levels of protection as all other children, as is their right under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The work before us is daunting, and it's easy to feel defeated, but we don't have the luxury. So I will close my remarks with a quote from a refugee child who we spoke to that I've taken as inspiration as we head into this important week. He told us, by working together and never giving up, we can turn problems into chances, discrimination into acceptance, and hopelessness into optimism. I encourage all of us to take that to heart. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very important proposals, concrete, and I like you mentioned the non-punishment of victims. And now, briefly, an intervention from the floor. That Jürgen Schur from Libyan International Justice for Libya. Please, or a brief intervention, because after that we have to go to the second panel.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you for giving lawyers for justice in Libya the opportunity to participate in today's side event and to speak about the situation in Libya. I'll be trying to keep it short. To start with some numbers, also illustrating the importance of Libya in these discussions. According to the IOM, more than 700,000 migrants from 43 nationalities were living in Libya by June this year. And the UNHCR had registered more than 54,000 asylum seekers and refugees in Libya by November this year. And as we know, Libya remains a major transit country for refugees and migrants. The real figures are very likely to be higher, yet they already convey the sense of urgency when discussing refugee protection and human trafficking in the context of Libya. Make it very short, there is no meaningful protection in Libya, not from trafficking and not from other human rights abuses or international crimes. Asylum seekers and refugees are already either victims of human trafficking when entering Libya or become victims while they're present in Libya. And this is for various reasons. I'll highlight two. Libya's legal framework criminalizes the illegal entry, stay, and exit, and fails to recognize refugee status, which, in the absence of any asylum framework, renders all those entering Libya irregularly as criminals. And this results in their arbitrary detention for indefinite periods of time without access to due process and makes them highly vulnerable to being trafficked, amongst other things. The second reason is because the state-structured system that I just described briefly is enforced by a criminal network of militias, armed groups, and state-affiliated security forces. As we heard before, also in Libya, they treat those detained as commodities, sell them to other traffickers, use them for forced labor, and subject them to a litany of human rights abuses. According to the last report from the UN fact-finding mission on Libya from March this year, there are reasonable grounds to believe that migrants across Libya are victims of crimes against humanity and that acts of murder, enforced disappearance, torture, enslavement, sexual slavery, and rape are committed in connection with the arbitrary detention during, for example, trafficking and interception. So in Libya, excuse me, the primary migration management approach is through mass, arbitrary, and indefinite detention of asylum seekers and refugees. This lends itself to corrupt practices and paves the way for these horrendous violations and crimes to be perpetrated in detention sites. In these circumstances, the UNHCR cannot extend meaningful protection to a vast majority of refugees and asylum seekers in Libya. Libya is not party to the 1951 Refugee Convention, does not have a host state agreement with the UNHCR, does not recognize its mandate or the basic principles of asylum, and does not allow the UNHCR to carry out their work in full with their mandate. Libya recognizes quasi-protection of 9 specific nationalities who are protected from forced return in theory, and who could, for example, potentially be evacuated to emergency transit mechanisms in Rwanda or Niger. However, this does not protect them against arbitrary detention, and it fails to protect them and all the other nationalities from the prevailing network of trafficking. Some very short potential possibilities to increase protection. Policies of return to Libya must end, and that includes putting a stop to supporting Libyan authorities to intercept boats by training, funding or equipping relevant authorities, including Libyan coast guards, as this will only serve to restart the circle of arrest, detention, trafficking, and the crimes that I just described. Let me do one more, please. I have a list, but I'll limit it to one more, because it has come up in the previous interventions. States should put more resources into prosecuting and dismantling trafficking networks, including financial flows, so as to stop the impunity with which they are currently allowed to operate. And this should not only focus on human trafficking, but prosecuting those responsible for the crimes associated with trafficking, which, as mentioned before several times, and which has also been found by multiple organizations and institutions, including the ICC, have found to be likely to amount to crimes against humanity in Libya. Those prosecutions will also help to show the systematic nature and then help to provide justice to victims. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this bleak picture of the situation of refugees, victims of human trafficking in Libya. And now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor and to the moderation to Professor Moulali for the second panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to all of our panelists who discussed their focus on protection. We're going to move straight into the next panel just to save time, and I would ask the speakers to join us here on the podium. So this panel is is on the topic of focus on prevention, and while people are taking their seats, I will introduce our panelists. First we will have Gráinne O'Hara, Senior Human Rights Advisor, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We will then move online to Belonsi Mukamusi Gauri, Head of Anti-Trafficking and Migration Sector, Caritas Rwanda. Veuthey New, Head of Programs at Refugee Law Project Uganda. And then finally online, Francesca Pizzutelli, Deputy Director and Head of the Refugee and Migrants' Rights Team at Amnesty International. So moving straight ahead, so that we can catch up on time a little, I'm going to give the floor now to Gráinne O'Hara. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Moulali. On behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the issue that I would like to address today takes us right back to some comments that were made in the introduction when our chair first put up that slide showing all the different bodies of law that are relevant and applicable to our collective efforts to counter trafficking. And then also Professor Moulali's own comments where she, in her intervention and drawing on the report that she's done, reminded us all that there does tend to be a very heavy emphasis on the criminal side of combating trafficking. And while this is extremely important, and not least because of what we've heard about the realities from Libya and how important it is to maintain these criminal enforcement efforts that are focused on the traffickers and not those that are victims of trafficking, there are other bodies of law that we think can play a contributory role in prevention and response to trafficking. And of course, first and foremost amongst these, speaking on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner, is that entire body of law that is international human rights law. Now, at its most simplistic, but also at its most ambitious, proper upholding of human rights standards can have a preventative impact on trafficking, because if in the first place people's human rights were better respected and supported, it would have a positive impact on reducing vulnerabilities and therefore reducing some of the risks of trafficking and the horrendous results that we see. Within the human rights normative framework, there are many relevant references to trafficking and trafficking-like situations, starting, for example, from Article 4 and 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as was mentioned, is being commemorated as we speak, just down the hall from us, on the 75th anniversary occasion of that declaration. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks to the prohibition of slavery and servitude. Other examples from the canon of human rights law include Article 19 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which speaks to the protection of children from all forms of violence and abuse, including sale and trafficking. Article 9 of the International Convention on the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, speaking to the right to security of the person, prohibiting any types of torture, cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment. And from the multiple examples we've heard so far, quoting the testimony of victims of trafficking, I think there can be no doubt that trafficking reaches this type of level and should be seen as a treatment rising to this level that needs to be eliminated. The Convention on Torture, likewise, has some relevant references for us to draw upon. And from these international human rights standards, similar standards are reflected across significant regional instruments, including the Convention of Europe's Foundational Convention on the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, and then subsequently also the Council of Europe's Convention on Action Against Trafficking. And similar measures in different regions of the world through the OAS, work on the American Convention on Human Rights, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and the Arab Charter on Human Rights. They all provide some relevant framing in the human rights field. But as we have heard from several speakers, the words themselves are not enough. There has to be practical implementation of these appropriate human rights standards. And in that respect, I'd like to speak firstly and briefly to one of three documents on which the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has led, and which we hope can be useful to a wide array of stakeholders in pushing for the active implementation of human rights standards. And firstly, I want to speak to the work that was done in the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights to produce, in 2002, the recommended principles and guidelines on human rights and human trafficking. And this is a set of guidance that, valid till this day, we think offers some practical advice on how to assist lawmakers and national parliaments to take practical action on eliminating the scourge of human trafficking. 17 principles divided under 4 different headings, followed by 11 guidelines, many of which are directly relevant to what we're talking about today. Firstly and foremost, this document talks about the primacy of human rights, the importance of putting the human rights of the victims of trafficking, amongst them refugees and asylum seekers, to the forefront of all our action. Second, the principles speak to protection and assistance, and in that they raise several reflections on the question of illegal entry, unlawful activities, and highlight again the message that it should not be the victims of trafficking who are criminalized under these headings. Rather, the fact that victims of trafficking can fall foul of state laws on illegal entry or other unlawful practices, given some of the areas that they are trafficked into. These should be points of reference to support their protection, not points of reference to justify their further persecution. And this particular principle is of direct relevance and one of the links to what we're talking about today in terms of how human rights law and other bodies of law is relevant to the protection of refugees, because the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees has a specific component where it speaks to refugees under Article 31 not being punished for having undertaken illegal entry. So here we see a direct link between the efforts we're all making collectively on trafficking and a specific protection under international human rights law. Also under these principles, on the question of criminalization, punishment and redress, Principle 17, and I'm underlining this, and I realize I'm repeating the point, but I think it's very significant considering what we've heard from some of those that have intervened before me, that states should ensure that trafficked persons are given access to effective and appropriate legal remedies. So not further traumatized, not further victimized, but given access to the protection of their human rights to which they are entitled. And foremost amongst these, again looking at the link between refugee law and human rights law, is the possibility of having access to asylum. There are two other similar documents, sets of principles and guidelines produced over the years by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, which we think could be useful and we want to bring to your attention. These are the recommended principles and guidelines on human rights protections of migrants in vulnerable situations. And while this is a document that looks more at the migration situation rather than the refugee situation, as we have heard from a previous speaker, when we talk about response to victims of trafficking in the context of that greater kind of formulation of migration or human mobility or people on the move, ultimately, whether the person is deemed to be a refugee or whether they are considered more of a migrant, that status determination should not lessen the entitlement of any victim of trafficking to the full protection available through human rights. So we believe that this second set of principles and guidelines can also be relevant in making the human rights that we're talking about, those promises that have been made in laws, bringing them to life in practical and operational ways that will make a difference to the victims of trafficking. And last but not least, and I will close on this reference, also the recommended principles and guidelines on human rights at international borders. And again, as the name will be obvious to you, this relates to our belief from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that many times these, the worst forms of trafficking tend to take place in scenarios characterized by human mobility. And this last set of principles and guidelines that I've referred you to, while not specific to the rights of victims of trafficking nor to refugees, it's relevant contextually because it sets out some standards that should be made aware to all of those who are working in migration management, and to remind them of the fact that victims of trafficking have very specific human rights that need to be addressed in all aspects of migration management. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Gronya, and thank you for highlighting the importance of full protection of human rights, mobilising all of the resources of our international human rights protection system. We are now going to move online to our second speaker, Veuthey Mukamusigali from Caritas Rwanda.
Thank you so much, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to speak about interventions of Caritas Rwanda in refugee settings in the context of human trafficking. Basing on its mission, which is to assist people in need and to promote the integral human development, Caritas Rwanda, a humanitarian organization and member of the COATNET, is committed to work with other stakeholders, being national, international, to end human trafficking. In this regard, Caritas Rwanda, in close collaboration with all these stakeholders, implement different mechanisms to protect and assist vulnerable people against human trafficking by addressing their rights and their needs. Bearing in mind that refugees are considered as a group at risk, interventions of Caritas Rwanda in different refugee camps consist of supporting beneficiaries in terms of social and economic sustainability as one of the solutions of fighting against human trafficking. There are many factors that make refugees to be at risk to human trafficking, such as poverty, lack of economic opportunities, unemployment, lack of integration in refugee communities, lack of access to education, training, among others. All these factors provide human traffickers with fertile land and with potential victims of trafficking. One of the solutions to prevent the trafficking in the refugee camps is the use of graduation approach in supporting refugees. In its interventions since 2020, in partnership with the government of Rwanda and other partners, Caritas Rwanda follows a four-pillar approach in supporting refugees to graduate out of extreme poverty, to become self-reliant and prevent trafficking in persons. Let us now state the four pillars to fight human trafficking. The first pillar is social protection. Social protection provides preventive, protective, and promotive mechanisms for immediate basic needs. Example, give cash for food. The second pillar is livelihood. By securing regular and diverse income streams for households to support assets accumulation and economic empowerment. Here, give cash grant. The third pillar is financial inclusion. By providing improved income and risk management and financial empowerment, from savings and access to credits. The last pillar is social involvement. By equipping families with a confident mindset and positive behavior change. Example, participating in saving groups. In the following video, we are going to see the success story of one refugee who was a simple tailor and became a clothing manufacturer and exporter, preventing her from falling prey to traffickers thanks to the support of Caritas Rwanda. Please put the video.
nyuma baza kutwereka inkunga afashe mu magana inani ntabwo nyaburere muri konti afashe mu magana ane cya mbere nabuze ko imashini ya kabiri kugira ngo nigira ngo n'umunyeshuri wo kwigisha nabyo bifashe ngo ndangije atamukura ibitenge kabigurisha agushije akaza akareka n'utera ngo ntabwo kiri cyane ariko ntangira kuranza mu cyane natangiye karangura neza narangiza bakayigura bagiye kujya hanze bamara kugurira akabadodera nanjye gaprofita kudoda ibyanjye kabategera ko nanjye bakajya bakangishiriza ubucuruzi bwanjye bwatangiye nako byatangiye kugenda gakeya mu kugushiriza hanze viza zikuba nyinshi buri wese akajya atuma umuvandimwe we umuturanyi we nuko wagurira iriya bibahenze nabo bakabigura muri afurika iyo nakiguze hano ijana na mirongo itanu ngewe akakirangije mirongo itanu kanakidodera ibihumbi icumi mu byose hamwe ni ijana na mirongo itandatu iyo mbyohereje iyo ngize umugisha simisha kuri posita ahantu muhereze ngera yose kubera bakayigurishiriza ku madorari magana iyo ugiye gushyira kuri posita ukagura amafaranga ya posita muri kilo cya remana cyari mirongo itatu na bibiri ariko cyari kamutwiriza kuri mirongo itanu noneho ugafata muri ya mafaranga nashoye ijana na mirongo itandatu nashoye ko no kudoda birimo ryayo ngufasha umwenda ibitenge kuri totali gufata narangiza cyane bakakigurishiriza magana atatu ukuvuga ko tugira itsinda rya buri cyumweru ko yungutse kuzigama nk'umunsi ukazigama haragira umwuka menshi haragira umwuka make ariko dukoresha kuzigama kugira ngo rya tsinda rigende ridufasha kandi rifashe n'abagenzi bacu iki cyumweru zigama mu icumi byari mu icumi zigama zigira buri cyumweru ni ukuvuga ngo ayo mafaranga yo ni ihame ntabwo ni mbese uvuga ngo ubuzima bwarahindutse ariko kugeza iyi saha urabona inkunga umwana ntabwo yatsiba make y'amatsinda twabariye yo kwizigama no kwivuka njyamo ngafatamo ubundi ngakananisha ubuzima bwarahindutse.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We will move now to Veuthey Refugee Law Project. Veuthey Refugee Law Project.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Thank you so much for inviting Refugee Law Project to participate today as we commemorate the 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 30th anniversary of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's an honor to share insights from refugee law projects that we have been conducting to combat human trafficking, particularly within the context of forced migration. I'll just give you the context within which we have been working in Uganda. Uganda is known for its open door refugee policy, and we host 1.5 million refugees, the highest number in Africa, and we have over 1 million refugees coming from South Sudan, and because of the ongoing conflict in the Great Lakes region, we also have refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundi and other countries. So because of the conflict in the region, refugees in Uganda live on average for over 18 years, and this presents unique challenges and vulnerabilities for human traffickers to take advantage of this situation of being in a protracted situation. As the previous speaker spoke about, there are some drivers for human trafficking like poverty and unemployment. So Uganda has an open door policy, well globally praised, but it can contribute to human trafficking. In Uganda, refugees are given land to live on and farm, and they are enabled to move freely and access social services like education, start businesses, and find employment. So we can actually have scenarios where we prevent human trafficking. From 2019 to 2022, the Refugee Law Project collaborated with the Irish Center for Human Rights to conduct a research about the nexus between human trafficking, forced migration, and gender. And I will share some of the findings from the research. Uganda has implemented measures to counter human trafficking, and this includes the Prevention in Trafficking Persons Act in 2009. So we do have laws that strengthen coordination and capacity building at the national level. At an international level, Uganda is a signatory to the Palermo Protocol of 2000. Some of the factors contributing to human trafficking have already been mentioned by other speakers. That includes high unemployment, poverty, and criminality create conditions conducive to human trafficking. And right now, because of the ongoing funding shortages in the world, because of the war in Ukraine, we find that funding in Uganda has actually reduced when it comes to management of refugees. So refugees have been facing food shortages in terms of food rations, and then even cash provision, which is provided by World Food Program. So because of these shortages, it actually creates a situation where human traffickers can take advantage. So when human traffickers come, they can promise the refugees in the refugee settlements better education and jobs, working as housemaids in people's homes, or even working jobs in the hotel industry. So in terms of prevention, there is a need to advocate more for identification tools, increased training, and a toolkit for stakeholders. When it comes to identification, for refugees, it is just understood that human traffickers target nationals, but actually refugees are part of the population that can be trafficked. And also, when it comes to the prevention, we look at strengthening and enforcing the legal frameworks and enhance and enforce laws protecting refugees from human trafficking. This involves training of immigration officials, the judiciary, and also detectives who handle human trafficking. Most of the time when police or detectives arrest human traffickers, they actually prefer to have charges that are under the penal code, and they will not prefer charges that are under the human trafficking law. So there is a continued effort to actually have the judiciary, immigration officials, and police officers to be trained in human trafficking and to enforce laws. And then another prevention mechanism is also to provide refugees with proper identification and legal status so that it reduces their vulnerability to exploitation and facilitate access to other essential services. So most of the time, I'll just give an example. In the refugee law project last year, we took the Office of the Prime Minister, which is the agency that is responsible for management of refugees, and we found that they had stopped registering Pakistanis and Eritrean refugees, that they were not entitled to refugee status in Uganda. And the argument was because they do not share borders in Uganda. So you'll find that with this particular group, they would be vulnerable for exploitation. And when you look at most of the refugees who are trying to cross into the Mediterranean, you'll actually find that there are some Eritreans. And you may find that they become vulnerable to human traffickers because they are unable to access legal status in the country for which they have fled in. So these are some of the challenges. So if we strengthen their legal documentation, then you'll find that the refugees and asylum seekers will be less vulnerable to human trafficking. But I have to say that we were successful in this strategic mitigation piece, that the Eritreans and Pakistanis were offered, were registered as refugees, but then who knows what may happen to other population groups that do not know that they are entitled to refugee status in Uganda. Another prevention mechanism is to promote awareness within the refugee communities about the risks of trafficking and common recruitment tactics and available support services. Provide education and ensure access for refugee children to empower them with knowledge and skills that reduce vulnerability. Then also another prevention mechanism would be in economic empowerment, which the speaker spoke about before. Some of the economic empowerment can be offering skills building and vocational training programs to enhance refugees' employability and reduce dependency on exploitative employment. Also have programs with microfinance and livelihood programs to support refugees in establishing small businesses or income-generating activities to enhance their economic stability. With refugees having economic stability, then they will be less vulnerable to human trafficking. Another prevention mechanism is to strengthen the protection mechanisms within the refugee camps and settlements, including having safe spaces for reporting and assistance. Right now, some refugees do not have knowledge about the referral pathways or safe ways of reporting human trafficking. Another form of prevention is foster community networks. This involves building strong community networks that provide support, share information, and collectively resist trafficking. This may include and involve training in local languages, and in the training it will look at definition of human trafficking, explanation of concepts of human trafficking. Let me just conclude. So it will involve explanation of concepts of human trafficking in local languages. But what I want to emphasize is to prevent human trafficking, we just need to strengthen partnership and collaboration among governments, NGOs, and local communities to create a coordinated response to human trafficking. I had more to say, but because of time, I'll just stop here. But in conclusion, the fight against human trafficking in forced migration context demands sustained effort, collaboration, and a comprehensive understanding of the complex intersections at play. I appreciate your attention and welcome your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veuthey, and thank you in particular for highlighting the importance of a coordinated response and engaging all sections of government and civil society, as well as the importance of strengthening screening and referral pathways, excuse me, and mechanisms for translating and understanding persons trafficking in persons. We're going to move now online to our final speaker, Francesca Subtitles. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting Amnesty International today. I hope you can hear me. Yes, okay, so I would like to develop today one of the concepts that have the recommendations that have already been mentioned, and so the idea that in order to prevent trafficking, we need to expand safe and regular migration opportunities and pathways to protection. And I would like to delve a little bit more about what is a safe and regular migration opportunity. So when we refer to opening avenues for regular migration and admission, we are talking about obviously traveling regularly, and so reducing the need for people to embark on irregular journeys that are risky and precarious. But when it comes to safe migration opportunities, what exactly do we mean? So what we would like to argue today is that when we talk about safe migration, we need to include in the concept human rights compliant migration opportunities, because not all regular migration opportunities are also safe, meaning that not all regular migration opportunities are also human rights compliant. So the European Court of Human Rights, as you know, clarified in Veuthey versus Cyprus and Russia that a state's immigration rules must address relevant concerns related to encouragement, facilitation, or tolerance of trafficking. So this obligation includes the obligation to ensure that migration policies, including visa schemes, do not increase the risk of labor exploitation, domestic servitude, and forced labor. In other words, work visas must fully respect and protect the economic and social rights of migrants, including labor rights. In many of the cases of labor exploitation that Amnesty International has investigated during the past 10-15 years, the abuses suffered by workers, migrant workers, were not only due to the actions or failures of an individual employer or recruitment agency, they were linked to systemic problems in the way the migrant workers' employment is regulated in the destination country. In many destination countries, labor exploitation is rooted in serious flaws in the processes by which migrant workers are recruited and employed, which facilitate and enable recruitment agencies and employers to subject migrant workers to exploitative practices. So exploitative labor migration policies and visa schemes violate the obligation of states to prevent trafficking. These types of visas that we call exploitative visas include mainly two types of visas. So labor migration visas that give the employer control over the migrant worker's residence status, and labor migration visas that tie the migrant worker to a specific employer. When it comes to visas that give the employer over the migrant worker's residence status, this might be visas that need the employer to lead the administrative process, to issue, renew, or cancel visas and work permits, so that the migrant worker cannot complete the administrative procedure themselves, they need the employer to do it, or where the administrative procedure requires a document or an authorization by the employer, so that again, the migrant worker is not fully responsible for the process to obtain visa and work permits. The other type of exploitative visas, which are visas that tie the migrant worker to a specific employer, these are visas which require permission by the first employer for the migrant worker to change jobs or leave the country, or visas or work permits that expire either immediately or rapidly after when a migrant worker leaves a job or is fired. So to conclude this discussion, I have a few recommendations that I think are important when it comes to destination countries in preventing trafficking. What does preventing trafficking implies? Recommendations. In order to prevent trafficking, states should, number one, regulate employment and ensure the protection of workers, including migrant workers, including irregular migrant workers. Number two, reform labor migration policies and these schemes that give the employer control over the migrant workers' residence status. Number three, reform labor migration policies that tie migrant workers to a specific employer. And finally, ensure that all migrant workers are able to report instances of labor exploitation and obtain an effective remedy for human rights violation. And thank you very much for listening to me, and sorry for dropping offline.
Thank you very much, and thank you for highlighting the importance of preventing trafficking for purposes of forced labour and the concrete mechanisms and measures that can be adopted to do that. As I said, we're now very quickly, we're slightly over time, but we started late, so we will just take 10 minutes of your time, if that's okay, and open up to the floor. And I'm going to give the floor to Catherine Meredith from Doughty Street Chambers. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you to the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, Excellencies and distinguished participants. On the theme of prevention and protection procedures in compliance with international legal obligations, I wish to make 3 points. First, as the Special Rapporteur said in the July 2023 report, there are concerns that many protection clusters contain gaps when it comes to prevention of trafficking or protection of trafficked persons. There are also failures of protection. States must ensure effective access to asylum and protection procedures for trafficked persons and persons at risk of trafficking. These procedures must also comply with international legal obligations to identify, to protect, to assist victims of trafficking, and they must comply with the principle of non-refoulement. Second, in the UK, unfortunately, in the past 2 years, the government has adopted draconian laws and policies which, for example, increase the use of accelerated procedures, inadmissibility procedures, and third country processing procedures. Last month, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unlawful to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, including asylum seekers victims of trafficking. But today, this afternoon, the UK Parliament is debating the law to do just that. This is unlawful, and these repressive policies have been widely condemned by the international legal community and by domestic lawyers, including ourselves. These procedures, these policies have emptied the protection out of asylum and protection procedures. They increase the risks of trafficking and exploitation and refoulement. They create a free path to traffickers. Finally then, to conclude, at this Global Refugee Forum, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we as lawyers urge the UK to make a multi-stakeholder pledge to comply with domestic and international law, to uphold the rights of those at risk, and to adopt legislation and policies to ensure access to assistance and protection for all victims of trafficking and asylum seekers. And for my part, and as lawyers, we pledge to continue working with colleagues to ensure effective access to protection procedures and effective access to justice and to legal remedies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I would highlight also that the multi-stakeholder pledge includes the possibility for specific commitments to supporting access to justice, including through expanding legal assistance and legal aid, and is open to states and civil society actors and to lawyers' associations. I'm now going to move online to Caritas Albania. Thank you.
Hello, is this me?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We can hear you. Yes.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from Tirana. Today I stand before you as a representative of COATNET. I'm Marina Nikki. I'm the head of Migration and Trafficking Department in Caritas Albania. I will represent COATNET, the Christian Organization Against Trafficking Network, a network deeply committed to combat human trafficking and assist survivors of modern slavery. I am honored to present to pledge our commitment to strengthen global action against human trafficking and protecting the rights of people on the move. Few words about COATNET. COATNET was established with a strong commitment to denounce human trafficking and protect the victims. We currently have around 30 members operating in Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and more regions. Over the years of operation, COATNET has focused on a comprehensive approach addressing various issues at national and international level, such as provision of protection and support for the victims of trafficking, prevention, increasing public awareness, advocacy efforts, and also fostering collaboration with other entities. In keeping with the core of COATNET's mission, all members are committed to addressing urgent issues related to human trafficking in line with the overall objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees, and we support the multi-stakeholders pledge. COATNET's pledge outlines 4 key commitments to be implemented in the 2023-2027. First commitment: raise awareness of human trafficking in all its forms, using a human rights approach, placing victims and survivors at the heart of the process. All the members of COATNET will raise awareness regarding human rights and human trafficking. The dissemination of documents, reports, video messages, and strategic efforts is expected to enhance awareness among the general public, including vulnerable groups, complemented by the organization of side events and specific campaigns supporting the efforts of the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Under this commitment, we will empower communities with knowledge, fostering resilience against human trafficking, and encouraging a proactive stance against this crime. Second commitment: strengthen advocacy and training support. The focus is to empower COATNET members by supporting the implementation of tailored training programs and providing members with the skills to advocate for the comprehensive support, community integration and collaboration with host countries. Third commitment: in line with Global Compact on Refugees, focus on data-driven solutions, all the members will provide transparent insights into the efforts of each member, supporting the sharing of data and also creating a mapping system to contribute to up-to-date data representation, facilitating evidence-based decision-making and strategic intervention for the protection of refugees, migrants, and people on the move, especially with the protection of the victims and survivors of human trafficking. And 4, facilitating stakeholders' engagement and collaboration. We'll aim to facilitate the stakeholder engagement and collaboration, strengthening the collaborative environment among COATNET members and stakeholders. These emphasize the importance of collective responsibility and sustained collaboration to address challenges effectively, reflecting a sharing commitment to fostering partnership for the benefit of those affected by human trafficking. In conclusion, I try to be very short to respect your time, but in conclusion, addressing human trafficking demands joint efforts on global scale and specific action at the local level. Our pledge means a strong commitment to safeguard the refugees, asylum seekers, and people on the move in the continuous battle against trafficking. COATNET is committed to strengthening its efforts, fostering global cooperation to mitigate the risk of trafficking and respond to the needs of the victims. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping it short also. We're now going to move to Patricia Ho, also online from the Hong Kong Dignity Institute.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to get straight to the point. I was going to share a little bit about the pattern of trafficking we see in Hong Kong, but having heard many of my friends here, it seems to me that there's a very common element of traffickers using the asylum system as a means to allow victims of trafficking to stay in Hong Kong. That's one thing. And the other thing would be that traffickers would target refugees as victims, and they become victims later after they're in Hong Kong. Now, the unique situation we're facing in Hong Kong is that human trafficking and forced marriage as well as forced labor are not actually criminalized. So we're working in a situation where, although the authorities will denounce human trafficking, they have actually, and bizarrely, taken stringent efforts to resist any calls for legislation in this regard. This also means that when it comes to the non-punishment principles, there is no law protecting victims of trafficking, only mere suggestions to prosecutors that they should take these matters into account. So in Hong Kong Dignity Institute, what we're really trying to do is we're working with the different local partners, with the legal communities, to identify cases and then thereafter provide representation to push for the authorities to enforce the international principles. And in the process of this, we're picking some of the stronger cases to take strategic litigation cases. And hopefully, as we bring enough cases to the attention of the authorities, we will be able to call for the case for the enactment of legislation. And the final point I'll say is that another area we're putting a lot of time and effort into is just to provide psychosocial support, because all of these efforts are taking years for them to complete, and we're seeing that without this, none of the victims are able to endure the redress procedures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we can follow up directly on those points with you also. I'm now going to move to Susanna Hoff, online also from La Strada International. Suzanne?
Thank you very much. Yes, La Strada International, European NGO platform against human trafficking, which currently represents 33 anti-trafficking NGOs in 24 European countries. We would be very happy to support a multi-stakeholder pledge on protection for refugees and migrants at risk or affected by trafficking in persons. In particular, of course, as many speakers already said, to enhance the protection for asylum seekers, refugees, but also other migrant groups, which we see already in our daily work have large vulnerability and risk of exploitation and abuse, including trafficking and forced labor. And we see that not only the refugees that currently we assist and coming from Ukraine are very much at risk, but they have at least access to temporary protection, but that in particular those other groups who have difficulties accessing rights and often lack protection are much more at risk. So we also are very ready to commit and promote to the contribution of the implementation of legislative policies and practical measures, which is mentioned in the pledge, also to ensure that all victims of trafficking, regardless of their status, their ability or their willingness to cooperate with the authorities, have access. We currently see, and we strongly see that this is very difficult. Actually, as we speak, we are advocating for embedding this in the EU Anti-Trafficking Directive. The negotiations are again tomorrow, and it's very difficult, I must say, to get this into stronger embedded in European legislations and policies. We're also very strongly happy to, we also want to improve national cooperation mechanisms and referral pathways, because we see it's very important also to build the capacity of the relevant actors to recognize and detect the very forms of human trafficking, and we are sure that we can commit to that, and also to commit to the awareness raising and information provisions. And I would like to make one point in particular, very important if we talk about prevention, that refugees and migrants can safely report to really access to justice and support, because what we see now in nearly all European countries, adequate safe reporting is missing, and that means that those people who are still irregular, who became undocumented undocumented are still facing arrest, detention, and deportation. And here I would also highlight the strong need for effective implementation of the non-punishment provision. Being careful of the time, I'll leave it here, but we are very much ready to commit and to do advocacy and awareness to promote the pledges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to La Strada International for the pledge and also for highlighting the importance of safe reporting, which is something that we see also in the Global Compact in migration. So thank you very much, and thank you to Pelnat for that pledge and for all of the work in supporting access to justice, which is critically important for victims of trafficking and those at risk of trafficking, including among refugees and asylum seekers. I'm afraid we have to conclude. We have run a little bit over time, but on my behalf, on behalf of the mandate of Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, I want to say a huge thank you to our co-hosts and co-sponsors, in particular to UNHCR, to the Order of Malta, to Caritas and COATNET, and to all of the states co-sponsoring the event today. We have heard quite a bit about the many challenges, the brutalizing, serious human rights violations that are faced by victims of trafficking, including those who are asylum seekers and refugees who are seeking international protection. We have also heard concrete commitments to action from states, from civil society, from international organisations. It may sometimes seem overwhelming, but the multi-stakeholder pledge sets out concrete actions that can be taken primarily by states, but also by other actors, development partners, international organisations, civil society, lawyers associations, faith-based organisations. These are concrete measures that can be taken to prevent trafficking in persons, protect those at risk, and ensure effective access to asylum and international protection. And we need to renew that commitment here as we begin this week with the Global Refugee Forum and the 75 years commemoration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So a huge thank you to all of you. I want to thank our interpreters who've been assisting throughout the event. Thank you to all of our panelists and chairs. Thank you. Have not yet made a pledge. It is open and will remain open, so I would encourage you to do that, and we're happy to provide any advice or assistance on that. Thank you again.
Merci beaucoup, votre soutien est absolument indispensable dans notre action au quotidien.